They put me in the wrong room for 3 weeks before anyone noticed. The intake form said, audit only, exchange placement, observe and report. It did not specify which seminar. The Drenith Academy's administrative grid apparently read, mortality, in my credentials. 14 years of field trauma medicine across 6 deep posting rotations, and slotted me into the theoretical mortality assessment tier, the way you'd sort a misaddressed parcel by the heaviest word on the label. I found out I didn't belong there on the morning of the 9th iteration. The chamber held 20 seats arranged in a shallow arc around a central simulation array. The Solvren Triage Architecture, a system the Academy had been running for 11 years to stress test the ethical decision frameworks of its most senior cadets, before they were cleared for Colony Fleet Command. 19 of those seats were occupied by cadets who had spent 3 years building the philosophical scaffolding this simulation was designed to test. My seat was in the observer tier, 1 step back and elevated, behind a small rail. I had a notepad. I had no console. Examiner Veth Orvac entered from the side door. He was tall in the way Kel Sorvani are tall, vertical and very still, the gill plates along his jaw running pale silver in the resting state. He did not look at me. He addressed the 19. Cascade 7, he said. You have reviewed the prior 8 iterations. You know the result. None of your cohort has produced a passing output. Today you will attempt it again. The architecture does not grade on effort. It grades on outcomes. One of the cadets, a Vel Ashrani female with articulated shoulder ridges, clearly senior, shifted in her seat. Small movement. She had reviewed 8 failures, and she knew what she was walking into. I knew what I was walking into because I had done it in an unheated field station on Kepler 7c, while a monsoon took the roof off in sections. Different architecture, same problem. Cascade 7, as it turned out, was a colony ship life support triage scenario. The simulation presented a vessel with a failing atmospheric system, 1 working regeneration node, and a passenger manifest sorted by medical vulnerability. The architecture fed inputs in real time, a secondary failure here, a power routing constraint there, and it escalated. Every decision a cadet made generated 3 downstream consequences, and the system kept escalating until the decision maker either produced a coherent triage priority sequence or locked up. In 9 iterations, across 19 cadets per iteration, the architecture had not received a coherent sequence. I understood why, watching from the observer tier, about 4 minutes in. The cadets were thinking about it. That sounds reductive. I don't mean it reductively. They were doing exactly what 3 years of ethical framework training had prepared them to do. They were weighing the philosophical dimensions of each decision, running the downstream consequences through their moral architecture, trying to produce an answer that was not merely correct but justified. The architecture was scoring justification. It was built on the assumption that the only way to produce a coherent triage sequence under escalating pressure was to have a sufficiently robust ethical framework that could generate justification faster than the Cascade could generate inputs. The problem was that the Cascade was faster than any framework. I watched Cadet Vel Sharan, the shoulder-ridged female, clearly the sharpest in the room, lock up at the 14-minute mark. She had made 7 decisions, each one defensible, each one generating a downstream consequence she then had to justify, and by the time the architecture escalated to the 3rd atmospheric node failure, she was carrying the philosophical weight of all 7 simultaneously, and the 8th decision simply stopped coming. Her gill plates would have gone pale if she had gill plates. She didn't. Her shoulder ridges dropped. The architecture registered framework saturation and moved to the next cadet. I was taking notes in the margin of my intake form by then. Not on the cadets, on the simulation's escalation architecture. I was annotating the sequence intervals, the gap between each input and the next, the pattern the system used to select which downstream consequence to surface first. 14 years of field incident reports leaves a particular habit in the hands. You write while the thing is happening because you cannot trust your memory of it later. At the 31-minute mark, the last cadet locked up. Framework saturation filed 18 times. Veth Orvac was still. His gill plates had been running a deep copper since Cadet Vel Shoran's lockup. That particular color, I had learned in 3 weeks of observation, meant something in the neighborhood of "this is not going the way I expected," and I expected it not to go well. A specific shade of professional disappointment. He looked at the observer tier. At me. "You have reviewed the Cascade," he said. It was not a question. "I've been watching it," I said. "The architecture requires a decision maker to close the iteration. Without a closure input, the simulation data degrades." He paused. "You have an observer credential. It allows console access for documentation purposes." I looked at my notepad. I looked at the empty console to my right, which I had not touched in 3 weeks, because my intake form said, "Observe and report." "How long until the data degrades?" 11 minutes. I picked up the console stylus. The architecture loaded Cascade 7 from the point of last input. The colony vessel, 612 passengers, 1 functioning atmospheric node. Monsoon of secondary failures already in the queue. I had been watching it for 31 minutes. I had the escalation pattern in the margin of my intake form. I did not think about it the way the cadets had thought about it. I worked the manifest by vulnerability index, pulled the node's output rating, divided the load into 3 priority brackets, and began routing. When the first secondary failure hit, a power coupling on the secondary oxygen line, I rerouted around it the way you reroute around a collapsed access corridor in a field station, which is to say immediately and without ceremony, because the alternative is standing in the corridor, thinking about the philosophy of collapsed access corridors, while the people on the other side of the door run out of oxygen. The architecture escalated. I worked it. I was not making ethical decisions. I was making logistical ones. The ethics had been decided 14 years ago, in the first week of my first deep field posting, by a supervising physician who looked at me over a patient and said, "You work the one in front of you, then the next one, then the next one, and you don't stop to ask whether you're doing it right, because doing it is what right looks like." That was not a philosophical position, it was a sequence. I had been running the sequence ever since. The architecture fed me a 3rd node failure at the 6-minute mark. I rerouted. A pressure loss in the secondary hull at minute 8. I bracketed the affected passenger sections and redistributed the load. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the simulation reached the end of the Cascade's escalation queue. The input feed stopped. The chamber was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the way a room goes quiet when it is waiting for something to come in and categorize what just happened. The architecture took 37 seconds. Then, result, indeterminate, decision pattern, no ethical deliberation phase detected, triage sequence, internally consistent, passenger survival rate, 94.7%, classification, no existing category. Veth Thorvak's gill plates had gone white, not pale silver, white. I had not seen that color in 3 weeks of watching him. I set down the stylus. I looked at the simulation summary on the console, which showed a green routing map over the colony vessel's deck plan. 612 passengers sorted into 3 brackets, most of them alive. "Is there a next iteration?" I said. 7 wasn't the last Cascade in the sequence. Veth Orvak did not answer immediately. He was looking at the console output, or at the space where the output was, in the way you look at something when you are revising a category you have held for a long time. "Cascade 8, he said finally, "is run with the senior cohort at the end of the academic year." "I'll be here," I said. I picked up my notepad and my intake form, with its marginal annotations, and I went to get coffee, because it was past the hour I usually got coffee, and the field habit does not care about simulation results. The architecture's indeterminate file, I was told later, was the first one it had generated in 11 years of operation. Veth Orvak filed a notation recommending the scoring rubric be reviewed. He listed the relevant credential in the margin. He listed it as Field Sequence Practitioner, Classification Pending. He did not have a better word for it. Neither did anyone else.